Test, test. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Oh, it is good to see your faces, even if it's only the top half of them. It has been a long time since we have gathered together in person, and it is great to be here. For those of you who don't know, I'm John Carlson. I direct the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and this is our annual Hart Nikachos Lecture in Peace Studies. This pandemic has really been something, and I hope that we were thinking about this the other day. It was May 2020 when we last gathered in person for an in-person event, and so hopefully now we are well on the other side of the pandemic, and certainly the worst of it. In fact, I just got a New York Times alert, this is true, that the FDA is moving to allow people to get a different vaccine booster than the initial one they received. That's kind of important news. Meanwhile, some Trump supporters are still moving to get a different president than the initial one we elected, alas. In any case, I do want to catch you all up on a few things that we have been doing in the center over the last 18 months. I hope many of you were able to catch our online events. And we also started several new projects, including our Beyond Secularization project. And we also launched our Recovering Truth project and podcast. And we have 3 podcasts, episodes that are all available online now. So I encourage you to check those things out. We are in something of a transition mode right now as we come out of the kind of full pandemic online virtual environment. And our beloved communications and events coordinator, Sarah Lords, has moved on to a great position in another organization. So we are missing her dearly, especially Carolyn and Matt, who did the lion's share of organizing today's event and reception. And to them, I'm very, very grateful. And of course, they're probably not here because they're out doing organizing things. So I thank them in absentia. And we'll be hiring a new event coordinator who'll be starting later this month, and we're hiring additional personnel, including a new person, our business operations specialist, Milu Cabrera, who's in the back of the room. So I'd like to introduce you all to Milu. Very happy to have you. And we're gearing up for a very, very ambitious spring calendar. Lots of in-person events, so stay tuned. Sign up for our newsletter, emails, follow us on Facebook and Twitter if you like. A few other housekeeping items before we get started. Please remember to silence your cell phones. You don't want to be that guy or that woman who, goes off. We know how that goes. Okay. Our event is also being live streamed, so special welcome to our online audience. Thank you. Hello out there in TV land. And this is, very importantly, a part of ASU's Humanities Week, which is kicking off today and runs throughout the week until Friday. There are numerous events and open houses across campus that highlight the ways in which students and faculty are exploring the human adventure across time, culture, and place. You can search ASU Humanities online to learn more about other events. You can pick up a calendar of events out there as a flyer on the schedule. That's on the table, or you can talk with our very distinguished guest here today after our event. Special welcome to Dean Jeffrey Cohen, who is our Dean of Humanities, whose idea it was to create this inaugural event. So we're very pleased to be able to participate in that, and very pleased to have you here, Jeffrey. Thank you. I'm going to now, one other very important thing. Please join us after today's talk for a reception that will be held in the Secret Garden. It's not that much of a secret where it is. You can probably figure it out if you don't know. But yes, please do stick around for some refreshments, libations, etc. Afterwards, so that we can demask and socialize more comfortably out there. So I'm going to get on to the event at hand and turn the mic over to Professor Yasmin Saikia, who is Professor of History and the holder of our Hart Nikachos Chair in Peace Studies here at the Center. Where is Yasmin? There's Yasmin. I haven't seen Yasmin for goodness knows how long in person, so lovely to see you, Yasmin.
Thank you, John.
You'll need that.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. It's really wonderful to have, movement on the hallway. It feels like we are all back. despite, as John said, we are wearing masks. I'm very, very happy today that we are able to reconvene to have the annual Peace Lecture, the Hart Nicoch's Peace Lecture, which is part of a series on peace research and peace teaching that we do here at the center that basically advances research, teaching, and public programming, and enables our students, our faculty, and community to actually think about not only issues that have happened in the past, but how we can engage with challenging problems of today. The lecture series and many other activities connected with the peace research and the peace teaching that we do here has been supported initially by the very generous grant of a private donor, Professor Emeritus Anne Hart. It is actually quite strange not to see her here today because she's normally always here, but as she's aging, probably today she's listening to us online. So thank you, Anne, for your generous support, and for the generous support of many of you here who have been and are new friends of our center. So without your private donations, without your support and your presence, we cannot do the work that we do. So it is with this combined effort that we are able to move ahead. Thank you. I have actually the great honor and the privilege of introducing to you today the annual Peace Lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Keith David Wattenpaugh. Professor Wattenpaugh is an American historian and is the founding director of the Human Rights Program at UC Davis. He's a leading historian and an expert on human rights, on genocide and its denial, humanitarianism, and the role of refugees and displaced people worldwide. He's also a very prolific author. He has written 2 books, the first titled Being Modern in the Middle East, and the second one called Bread from Stones, the Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism. Besides his academic work, he has also been very active in the field of helping refugees, particularly refugee students, who want to relocate to another place to continue their studies, and as a program that has received very wide acclaim. He has developed something called the Article 26 Backpack Project, which enables refugee students to digitally store their academic credentials and that they can use when they move to a new university. This is a major undertaking. He's currently writing his third book, which also has the title of today's lecture, and I hope when he writes the book, he will say that part of it also came from the discussion at CSRC at ASU. The lecture today is titled after the book, which is The White Savior and the Waif, Listening to Humanitarianism's Unheard. For some of us who are directly involved with peace research at the center and at ASU, we have developed a concept called People's Peace. And it is under this umbrella concept that we are finding Dr. Wattenpaugh's writing and his research very useful to think about inclusive humanity by focusing on people who have been cast aside from the embrace of nations and states and live as transformed people under labels called refugees and displaced people. We believe that a concern for the vulnerable and creating humane and effective solutions is prescient and extremely important for furthering our own research on people's peace. So we look forward to this talk and learning a great deal from it as we move forward. This afternoon, however, more than this lecture, we had a wonderful 1-hour discussion in my class, a course that is called Envisioning Peace. And my students had a variety of questions on a topic that, on an article that Professor Wattenpaugh had written called Are There Still Children for Sale? So there was a lot of discussion on genocide, forced displacement of children, and how to rethink the agency of invisible constituencies of children in times of conflict. The students, of course, learned a great deal, And I hope Professor Wattenpaugh, too, will take some of the questions that the students raise for a fresh rethinking of how to advance the study of humanitarianism history in the times of conflict now with an eye for the future. So please join me in welcoming Professor Wattenpaugh to deliver the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasamin. That's great. They've got me mic'd up, so I don't need the other one. So, Matt, can we think about lowering the lights up here just so that we can see the screen just a little bit better? And while he's doing that, I'll explain to you my COVID procedures here. I'm going to take my mask off, but I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm not going to go too close. Okay? So if people could mask up properly, that would be great. And I will take mine off. Right? So my students, some of them I lecture with my mask on, and some of them have never seen me without my mask, which is great because then I can like go around campus and they'll never know who I am. So I want to, I'm also, I'm a professor, which means that if you give me somewhere to talk, I will just keep talking. So I've prepared my comments in order to keep them under around 30 minutes or so to provide ample opportunity for talk and conversation. And if people are interested also in learning more about the Article 26 Backpack Project we're doing with refugee young people around the world, I'd be happy to talk about that too. And I'll also be showing images up here on the screen. So first and foremost, I really want to thank Professor Sakia and her team here, Matt Correa especially, and I really did have a wonderful time with the students this afternoon. It was exciting, and I will make a proper report of you when I get back to Davis about how great ASU students are. All right, we'll beat you in every sport, but at least we'll do this. Well, actually, we can't beat ASU in any sport. So and I've enjoyed learning a lot about the program, spending time with John today, and our shared interest in the possibilities and the problems of anything called humanitarian intervention as well. So as my talk begins, and as is the case, as my talk begins, and as is the case when we study the problems of human rights, peace, and genocide, I will speak of war, mass violence against civilians, the abuse and trafficking of children, rape, and murder. And one of the documents, historical documents I share, includes racial slurs. However, I will not be voicing them. So real human beings are at the center of those abuses, both victims and perpetrators. They are not abstractions, even though they speak to us from a great distances of space and time. So I'm an academic, as I said, but I will do my very best to make sure that this talk, a word I much prefer to the word lecture, is not too academic, especially at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, when I know my thoughts turn to either naps or a tall, cold one. And I'll be doing that by weaving stories and images together to make the case at the core of my current book project, The White Savior. My current book project, The White Savior and the Waif, Listening to Humanitarianism's Unheard. In that book, I argue that centering the voices of refugees, mass rape victims, and genocide survivors in the study of the contemporary history of humanitarianism is fundamental to creating a more humane, non-discriminatory, and effective humanitarianism in the now. A point of inspiration for that book was 2020's Summer of Black Lives Matter protests in the US and abroad, which brought to the surface concerns about racial discrimination and inequality in the Nobel Prize-winning humanitarian NGO, Doctors Without Borders. 1,000 employees sent an open letter decrying, quote-unquote, dehumanizing field operations overseen by a, quote-unquote, privileged white minority. One of those signatories, the British physician and chair of the UK's MSF board, Javeed Abdulmu'min, wrote, quote, I have understood how the humanitarian aid sector at large is an industry that is a product of a paternalistic white savior complex bound close to the old and despicable colonial narrative of the white man bringing civilization to the savage. This is reflected in today's image of the European humanitarian movement bringing succor to needy people of Africa. And he continues, MSF language perpetuates those powerful colonial tropes. We go on mission. I'm an expat. We're beneficiaries, unquote. It's not just been MSF facing criticism. Oxfam, Save the Children, the International Rescue Committee, and agencies of the UN have all come under pressure from within and without their organizations to confront the historical legacies of colonialism and address what the Nigerian-American writer Teju Cole calls the white savior industrial complex. And they're being called out in their operations, media, and especially collaborations with human rights abusing states. I too have heard echoes of that complex as I have worked with refugee university students from the wars in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the DRC over the last 8 years, as I've sought to help them improve their access to higher education in the Ford Foundation supported backpack. So the humanitarian industry that Abdul Mu'nim describes has remained largely unchanged and unexamined during the last century. What is different now, though, is that the voices of those facing abuse and discrimination can more easily be raised through forms of social and traditional media and the arts and literature. Equally, as the MSF letter shows, those voices have become more difficult to silence. Listening to those voices, and those of refugees, genocide survivors, and relief workers in the field, has been a problem for historians and others in the humanities and social sciences, limiting the value of those disciplines to ongoing public debates about humanitarianism. So what I'm seeking to do in the book is reject the way humanitarianism envisions and creates what I call the waif, the abandoned, adrift, alienated, often female human that sits at the center of humanitarianism. The waif is the most durable image of humanitarian history because of her prominence in the self-justification and logic of humanitarianism itself. I'm sharing with you a visual representation, a good visual representation of that idea. This is a 1915 Near East relief poster that was produced to raise money for genocide survivors during the First World War and the Ottoman Empire. And here you can see the presentation of America in Colombia, right, with her arm with a sword, and then the child almost cartoonishly portrayed with the American flag draping over her. The refugee or survivor in this case becomes a mere symbol, incapable of possessing history because of the timelessness of her nature and dependence upon the humanitarian for mere survival. At the same time, the waif legitimizes the racialized, paternalistic, and ahistorical practices of the white savior, which hearken to colonial pasts and reveal the structural inequality and inequities in the present. An equal goal of this work is to demonstrate how the tools of the humanities can support organizations like MSF, which are engaged in fundamentally important work, and can help them also begin and sustain the kinds of critical conversations about their industry's past with more of a historical understanding of the colonial and compromised history of humanitarianism. I want to create a framework for a new way of thinking about humanitarianism that centers on the human, shared humanity, and human rights. But before I do that, I want to recognize that this is your Humanities Week and reflect on the path I took as a humanities professional from being what I would call, without judgment, a very traditional, even buttoned-down historian of the modern Middle East, to still a humanities professional, but one who looks for ways to use the tools of the humanities. And here I'm thinking about language, storytelling, history, and memory to inform policy and ultimately seek to help create a more peaceful and prosperous world for all. This is my contribution to the people's peace. Faculty who have followed that path sometimes stand on the very edges of the academy or are pushed to the very edges of the academy. What I would like to think of as, frankly, the intersection of the humanities and society. For many of us, that move usually takes place in the wake of a major historical event or emergency. I'm not talking about anything so grand as a crisis of conscience, but rather a moment of encounter, followed by an intense process of questioning and wondering. So let me begin there. Part 2, the Iraqi National Library and Archive. So it is burned into my mind, not just because of what I saw, but also what I smelled and what I heard as my feet walked across the fragments of glass bookshelves in what had been the science periodical reading room of the Iraqi National Library and Archive. During the paroxysm of destruction and looting at the time of the US invasion and occupation of Iraq, this fundamentally important cultural institution had been set on fire. First to destroy potentially incriminating documents related to the dictator Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath Party apparatus, and then to cover up a robbery of antique books, manuscript, and computer equipment. Frankly, anything that could be carried off. The smell was unique. You combine that sickly sweet odor of burnt polyester fabric and the not quite wood smoke aroma of journal paper. There were hints still of the kerosene used to accelerate the burn. Thankfully, a group of Iraqis from the very poor Shia ghetto of Sadr City, on the outskirts of the capital, had taken it upon themselves to rescue some of the books, and in a ceremony that took place a few weeks after I left, had brought them back to the library. So I was there leading the first non-governmental group of international Middle East studies specialists, German, French, Jordanian, to try to understand the impact of the war and years of isolation under Ba'athist rule on Iraq's cultural heritage and institutions of higher education. I remember the anger and concern building inside of me as I stepped out into the 115-degree heat and bright sunshine. Once there, I was greeted by a different set of sights and smells. The famous statue of a headless Saddam in academic garb, and that high-pitched rapid whoop, whoop, whoop of Chinook helicopters passing between the airport and the American Center of Operations, the Green Zone. The Tigris River had almost no water in it, and the smell of rotting organic material and burning tires filled the air. The US had been bound by international law to protect Iraq's cultural and educational institutions, including its universities and museums. You break it, you own it. Iraqis, even those collaborating with the Bush administration lead up to the war, had told the US government about the vulnerability of these institutions. The US Army did guard the ministries of oil and finance, and that was one of the sources of my anger and confusion. I was also concerned for another reason. I studied genocide, the purposeful destruction of a people, including their culture, language, and history. An axiom of that field is that, as the German poet of Jewish origin Heinrich Heine wrote in 1821, I'm sure many of you know this, where they burn books, they will in the end also burn humans. The last 20 years of Iraqi history bears that axiom out. Beyond the 600,000 plus casualties, I note the 2006 war against the intellectuals, in which hundreds of the country's leading professionals were targeted for murder and kidnapping for political reasons, and by criminal gangs for extortion, to the genocide and enslavement of the Yazidi people upon the rise of the Islamic State in 2014. So when I stepped out of the library, I thought one thing: we're smarter than this. We have to outsmart war. And as I look back on that moment and how it's woven into my own professional and personal path, I sometimes think about a passage in a short story by Norm Mclean, of all things, whom my grandmother knew growing up in post-World War I Montana. Mclean is the author of the Meditation on Fly Fishing, A River Runs Through It, that Robert Redford turned into in 1992, starring a very young and very good-looking Brad Pitt. The story that I was thinking about is about a summer fighting forest fires and a 28-mile hike across the Bitterroot Mountains, USFS 1919. And in that short story, Mclean writes of the moment when, quote, life, instead of going sideways, backwards, forward, or nowhere at all, lines out straight, tense, and inevitable, as if life had been made and not happened. Standing beside Saddam's statue in the Baghdad heat, what I felt was the exact opposite. The brutality, chaos, confusion, cynicism, arrogance, and incompetence I witnessed that summer in Baghdad laid out anything other than a straight path. In a feeling I know my own students often feel, and what motivates them to take courses in human rights studies, and I'm sure what motivates them to study with you here, and then volunteer for refugee resettlement projects and eschew high-paying tech jobs to look for careers in public service, is a sense of how something was, and in fact is, broken. Our job in the humanities is not to deny complexity, missteps, or problems, or to make the crooked straight, nor to silence further the unheard voices that complicate simple stories, the stories with clear beginnings, middles, and ends. One of our jobs in the humanities is to make us think about the brokenness and surface and then listen to those voices of dissent and warning. I would hear over and over again from Iraqis, why aren't the Americans listening to us? Part of the problem in those days was that very few of the American personnel sent to Iraq could speak or read Arabic or had any understanding of Iraq's past. But more to the point, they saw no value in what the Iraqis had to say. So I wrote my first book about the middle class, which I think is more what my professor wanted me to do, and then moved on quickly and turned my focus to growing the field of human rights studies and trying to understand the intersection of the humanities, humanitarianism, and human rights in particular, and in particular in the wake of genocide. One outcome of that has been the Human Rights Studies program at UC Davis, which we believe is the best and the biggest. It's actually pretty big. The other was the book Bread from Stones, The Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism. And it was writing that book when I began to understand the way the same humanitarian project can appear so different when one is sitting in an office building in Manhattan or in a tent in a refugee camp in Port Said. This is a historic image of a refugee camp for Armenian survivors of the Armenian First World War genocide. And it's one of the first instances of a sort of modern style refugee camp with tents set out in rows. And in this case, the men and boys in the camp were expected to work in Egypt's war industry to help pay for their stay in the camp, which they were not allowed to leave. I've always wondered what this little boy was thinking as they were marched out of the camp. And in a side note, my wife, the noted art historian Helen Arzatli in Watanpa, her great-grandparents were interned in this camp before returning to Syria. So let me now move to the body of my talk. And begin to ask, to whom do we listen? So in this case, I want to turn and think about what it's like to look at a humanitarian issue or problem from the very pinnacle of power in a modern state, on the one hand, as opposed to through the eyes of a 5-year-old boy on the other. So let's start at the top, and I will construct a history using sources and materials produced at the center of the state and its narrative of the humanitarian. And part of this, many of these resources are actually available in English language memoirs. So in the spring of 1916, the World War I Ottoman governor of Greater Syria, what is today Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel, Jamal, established a residential orphanage school for Armenian and Kurdish war orphans. The school was located in a beautiful building in the quiet village of Antura, just to the north of Beirut, Lebanon, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. And here we can see an image of the building with the boys and a few girls lined up on each side in their uniforms and staff from the facility. In the preceding months, security concerns had led the Ottoman government to pass legislation removing ethnic Armenian citizens of the Ottoman Empire from what they termed special security zones in Anatolia. The Ottomans were fighting a war for survival against the Russian, British, and French empires. Many Armenians have been relocated to resettlement camps in northern Syria, where a locust plague and a famine, in part caused by a British and French blockade of the port of Beirut, had led to large-scale death from disease. Local authorities had grown concerned about roving bands of children who had been abandoned by their Armenian parents, and asked the governor to address the situation. For health, safety, and humanitarian reasons, he ordered government personnel to gather the children and relocate them to orphanages. In the case of Antura, he placed Halide Adib Adavar, seen here, in charge. Halide Adib was an American educated feminist and intellectual, and really from the highest echelon of Ottoman society. And she brought to the school a background in educational reform, including Montessori and humanitarian assistance programs for refugees and migrants. She was a great admirer of the work of Jane Addams and the Chicago-based Hull House, where Italian and Eastern European women were provided with job training and civic education. She was also a follower of Maria Montessori. At the orphanage, children were provided with a full curriculum, including math, science, civics, language, and training in some kind of industrial art like carpentry, in the case of boys, and weaving and domestic arts for girls. And they were generally being prepared for urban life. Most of them had come from the rural parts of Anatolia and Mesopotamia. They were being prepared for urban life as citizens of a post-war Turkey, as Turkish citizens. In one of her reminiscences of the period, Halide writes of the waifs in her care, quote, "The Armenian children were good musicians, and the brass band which was formed became the joy and the pride of the school. The Armenian children were nearer to the Turkish children than the Kurds in certain qualities, although nearer to the Kurds in race. I had never hoped to hear laughter in Antura. The most I looked for was less tears and less sickness. Yet I saw sturdy legs and chubby faces, and I often heard laughter and sounds of gaiety. The comparative friendliness and good health was very cheering," unquote. When it became clear that the Ottoman Empire was losing the war and Syria would soon be occupied by French and British armies, she asked Howard Bliss, the president of the American University of Beirut, to make sure that the Armenian children would be turned over to the American Red Cross, and that the Muslim children, here meaning primarily Kurdish, would be sent on to Istanbul in the custody of the Red Crescent Society. As she was leaving, she presented the college with a photo album of scenes from the orphanage, including this one. Karnik Panian, who as a child was placed in Antura, remembers it differently. In his 1992 Armenian language memoir, which was translated as Goodbye Antura 6 years ago, and he wrote it towards the end of his life, concerned that his children and grandchildren knew what had happened to him as a young person. Panian, who spent a career as an educator in Beirut, remembers being lifted onto a train by an elderly German pastor in late 1915 and sent to Lebanon. A few weeks earlier, his grandparents, his only remaining family, had entrusted him to the care of a German facility. And when he looked around at the other boys on that train, he saw, and I'm quoting, "Aboard that train were the last remaining sons of an annihilated nation, racing toward unknown shores, tossed about by the waves of fate. All that was left of our families and hometowns was our memories," unquote. That train ride and Panian's incarceration in the orphanage secured his survival at the very moment the majority of the indigenous Armenians of Anatolia, which before 1915 numbered over 1.5 million, had been murdered. Just a little over 250,000 remained. Panian came from a family of artisans and agriculturalists in the Anatolian town of Gurun on contemporary Turkish maps. Surrounded by cherry orchards and wheat fields, Panian remembers his life there, and in particular his mother's face, in heartbreaking detail. In a scene repeated hundreds of times throughout the areas with the densest population of Armenians in the spring of 1915, Ottoman forces, indeed following the passage of emergency legislation, separated men and older boys, including Panian's father, from the elderly, women and children. The men were summarily executed or enslaved to work for the Ottoman war effort, digging trenches or building railroads, before they too were murdered. Organized into caravans, the remainder were forced south into Syria, sometimes by train, sometimes on foot. The director of the Istanbul office of the Rockefeller War Relief Board, Edward Storer, wrote in his description of this map from a longer report on the situation, quote, "The desert south of Aleppo was filled with a struggling mass who had seen the foundations of all possible living destroyed in such a way that their initiative and resistance had disappeared." It's a marvelous map. It's in the Rockefeller Archive in upstate New York. And the yellow shows the paths of deportation, sort of collecting women, children, and the elderly. And then they don't know what's happened to them when they get to this point. And in fact, what is happening is that the survivors are being moved through a series of camps along the Euphrates River, where each move follows a mass die-off or murder of groups until when they reach Deir ez-Zor, which was a very important city in the recent war in Syria, most had died. Women and girls were systemically raped and sold along the way as household slaves or wives without their consent. Once beyond the Pale of Anatolia, authorities moved survivors through a series of death camps along the Euphrates River, where no provision had been made for their survival, and most perished. I still remember going to, you can't see it here, but to Deir ez-Zor or to Mclean, and you could still see bones from the survivors along the river. So once in state orphanages, Armenian children were converted to Islam and given Muslim names, boys circumcised. Little is known of the girls, most were placed as soon as possible into Muslim households, farmed out as domestic servants or married to Turkish soldiers, and would not be reconnected with the Armenian community as Panyan and the other boys would. Antura was part of what I call end-stage genocidal efforts, but also more. It functioned as a social science experiment, or to use a modern parlance, a pilot project for the adaptation of techniques, including Montessori and foreign language instruction, to full-scale national assimilation of non-Muslims and new immigrants in Turkey, primarily refugees from the Balkans and Russia. At Antura, young Armenians were not just to be converted to Islam and learn Turkish by default. What Halide Edip and her collaborators hoped to accomplish was to make Turks in the sense of a modern nationalist identity, rather than just educate and care for the young people by employing the full range of social work and leading-edge educational techniques. This meant that Kurdish and Armenian children, who were considered harmful to the homogeneity of the emerging Turkish nationalist polity, would be made harmless through forced assimilation. It was also an effort to make the inhumanity of the ongoing genocide more palatable to the nearby American observers during and after the war. So concerned was she about showing the humanity of the enterprise and escaping any recrimination that, as far as I can tell, she lied about the nature of religious and nationalist indoctrination at the school in her post-war English language memoirs. Memoirs which were reviewed well by the New York Times, that also referred to her as Turkey's Joan of Arc. You hear in Halide's voice and in the remainder of her memoirs the unmistakable refrain of the white savior and her unself-conscious celebration of the part she played in the destruction of a people. Panyan, I'll share a picture. This is an image of Panyan in the 1930s and with his family later in life. Panyan tells us that speaking Armenian at Antura brought about extraordinary moments of violence. Let me quote from his memoir. "I didn't know Turkish, nor did I know any Turkish names of numbers. All I knew was my true name, and I didn't see the point of changing it. The boy before me was asked his name, and he replied with his Armenian name. Without warning, the schoolmaster, Fevzi Bey, smacked him right across the face. The boy fell to the ground and began crying. His nose was bleeding. Furious, the headmaster screamed at him, 'Forget your name. Forget it. From now on, you will be Ahmed, and your number will be 549. It was my turn next. I said my name was Karnik. Now it was my turn to be slapped across the face and fall to the floor crying. The schoolmaster then kicked my sides as I lay prostrate on the floor. I eventually passed out from the pain, unquote. Panyan would wake up 2 days later in the infirmary with broken ribs. He remembers forced conversion and rigorous religious education and the use of brutal beatings with a falakha, a whip used on the feet for infractions, including engaging in Christian religious practices or speaking Armenian. Hunger was a constant, he writes, and they were always hungry. Read the memoir. They eventually they run away in order just to find food in a countryside that had been beset by famine. He writes, though, of a moment when some boys would bring bones from an unmarked grave nearby in which dead orphans and animals were buried, which they would then boil and eat. In an ellipsis that encapsulates the painful memories and unwarranted shame of his time in the orphanage, Panyan does not say whether or not he drank that broth. Throughout this period, Halide Edip was present at the orphanage. When the American Red Cross and a cadre of Armenian nurses arrived in the days after the Ottoman retreat, they found no adults and instead the children in charge. As Baird Dodge, a member of the faculty and later president of the American University in Beirut, explained in a report at the end of the war, quote, "Immediately the Armenian children asserted their rights. They refused to use their Turkish names and they brought out Armenian books, which they had hidden away in secret places during the Turkish regime," unquote. When Panyan left Antura, he was placed in the care of the American humanitarian organization Near East Relief, who had produced that poster I showed you at the beginning of the talk, that would seek to repatriate him and other orphans to Anatolia, though not to his town of Gurun, which had been ethnically cleansed of its Armenian inhabitants. Rather, the American humanitarian project existed in symbiosis with a doomed post-World War I French effort to create a colonial client state, much like Lebanon, in southern Anatolia called Cilicia. Within a few months of his return, Panyan was evacuated back to Lebanon, again the ward of a humanitarian organization, albeit American, and housed in an orphanage. So the broad outlines of this story and the juxtaposition of the voices of the powerful with the unheard should be familiar to North American audiences. At roughly the same time, and with similar justifications and techniques, indigenous children were incarcerated in Indian boarding schools, including one just a few miles from here, the Phoenix Indian School, which was established in 1891. Its founding commissioner, Thomas Morgan, noted at its dedication, quote, "It's cheaper to educate Indians than to kill them," unquote. The process of cultural erasure, religious and civic indoctrination, all justified as a form of humanitarian practice, indeed considered best practices in international social work and educational circles at the time, also constituted core elements of the cultural dimensions of the crime of genocide. I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," in relationship to the boarding school era. It was uttered by Captain Richard H. Pratt, founder of the U.S. Training and Industrial School at Carlisle Barracks in 1879. That's in Pennsylvania. The full quotation is, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres." In a sense, I agree with that sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead, kill the Indian in him, and save the man, unquote. One of the things that interests me about what he said is where and why he said it. It was a passage in an academic paper. It was a passage in an academic paper called "The Advantages of Mingling Indians with Whites," and delivered at the 1892 Denver meeting of the National Conference of Charities and Correction, the leading American organization of state welfare agencies, prison oversight boards, and what we might call now humanitarian NGOs. Jane Addams of Hull House, whom Halide Edip admired so much, was the first female president of that organization just a few years later. As I've been writing on the encounter of children with transfer, genocide, and cultural erasure while in the custody of humanitarians, I've been reading not just the memoirs of Armenian children, but also those of Native American and Australian Aboriginal children to better understand the unique and the shared, to follow the through lines drawing humanitarianism and genocide together. Among the most important of these, for me, has been Adam Fortunate Eagle's Pipestone. He had been in the Pipestone boarding school in Minnesota. Fortunate Eagle is a very compelling figure in modern U.S. history because, and especially for us in the Bay Area, because he's one of the organizers of the Alcatraz takeover by the United Indians of All Tribes now 50 years ago, and he was an early proponent of the establishment of Native American studies programs in U.S. higher education. Like Panian, he had entered a boarding school at 5, though in an era when some of the most violent forms of cultural erasure and hostility to language and other cultural practices had been dialed back. Still, even in 1935, he recalls, a group of boys were removed from a nearby Catholic missionary-run school and placed at Pipestone. They spoke of abuse at the hands of alcoholic priests and being beaten when they spoke Chippewa or Sioux. Listening to the stories those boys told to Fortunate Eagle, he and, quote unquote, the rest of the boys did not know what to say because it was so awful, unquote. I'm struck by the parallels and how valuable hearing these voices are in understanding the full measure of the role of humanitarian practices in genocide. It is this continual circulation of people and ideas engaged in modern humanitarianism in genocidal moments and the social scientific theories and practical tools developed to implement it that makes its presence in genocidal encounters so troubling. Recognizing this past and the role of states in social science, educators, and social workers is not just a cautionary tale. Let me just move to this slide here. It's not just a cautionary tale for contemporary humanitarian practices, but holds promise as movements in North America seeking to recognize and address those practices and their impact, both in the past and continuing, on the lives of Indigenous children go stronger. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are now open to questions, and we will take questions. And if you want to introduce yourself, that will be also great.
I can help with the mic if you want.
Yes, thank you so much.
I don't need to introduce myself.
Well, your question won't make any sense to anybody else because they won't be able to hear it.
I'm phrase white savior. I don't know if that's appropriate to continue that adjective in front of the word savior.
I don't understand your question.
Why do we say white savior?
I'm not talking about Jesus.
Pardon?
I'm not talking about Jesus. The Savior I'm not referencing is not
No,
Jesus.
but can't a savior of anything, a savior of what you're talking about.
The phrase white saviorism is a phrase used to describe the kinds of humanitarian, it's used to this notion that people living in other parts of the world can only be rescued, right, who are Africans or East Asians or South Americans can only be rescued by white people. They don't have the ability to rescue themselves. That's white savior. And you're welcome to disagree with me.
Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, hi, my name is Richard Amesbury. I'm a professor of religious studies. So yeah, I really appreciated your talk, and you know, I guess my question is, to what extent do you think that some version of humanitarianism can be recovered or reconstructed? Because I take it you remain committed to that cause in some sense, but of course there is a critique of humanitarianism that suggests that the problems that you described aren't simply incidental, but are kind of baked into the very dynamic of the whole thing. So I'm curious how you respond to that kind of
And I think that, I mean, what's important is my book before I wrote this was a book about how humanitarianism can work to try to advocate on behalf of refugees and displaced people, especially centering their rights in those conversations. And my critique of humanitarianism is that it is no longer a rights-based operation. That a rights-based approach to things like development, international assistance, might do better than the humanitarian approach, which is being critiqued as essentially the North doing things in the South. And so that's, and I think that we in the humanities and historians and others, we can play a constructive role in trying to recenter human rights within that. There'll be people who will criticize human rights as well, but I think that it works in this context. But also, it's a lot of the critique of humanitarianism is often done by people who've not participated in it or seen it firsthand, like I have been able to do. And I can say that I think there are opportunities for it to work, but there are opportunities that are built around mutual respect, about friendship, around developing capacities for people to engage not in their own saving, but just engage in addressing problems within their own communities in the ways we would hope to be able to address them in ours. But the thing is that the really important critiques have to do with the way humanitarianism often is, it creates a dependency between the humanitarian organizations and the projects in the field. And so part of the things that I have been arguing, I consider this very controversial and very problematic, is that I wonder if it's possible to conduct humanitarian operations or even engage in things like international assistance in countries that do not respect human rights. In other words, we just do not get involved until the situation is one in which it's more collaborative, it's on a more equal basis, it's invited, and it's a place where human rights are respected, and not one in which our humanitarian assistance will often help buttress countries that violate human rights. So it's a very good question, and you can tell I wrestle with it. I'm a full professor. I get to wrestle with fun questions like this, right? So, other thoughts?
Not yet? Okay, think about it.
I think a comment and a question. When I am a refugee and a refugee activist, so I see both sides of the advocacy as the experience itself and the advocacy, and I feel like with the white savior, complex, it's not only degradation of the people that are in it, but also the people that come out of it. Right? I have to emphasize all the time that I'm not a passive victim of oppression, but an active resistance to injustice everywhere. I feel like when I say a refugee, everybody is pitying me, and everybody's like, oh, poor you or whatever. So the emphasis is always there. So I would say and with the comment, the people that have engaged in the savior complex is white people. So that's a matter of fact. And also my question is, as an activist, I work with this community, with the refugee community. How do we, because it's an internalized narrative, right? That you have to please the white person and make them look like they're saving you in order for them to do the humanitarian work that you desperately need. Right. So how do I ask of them to overcome that while the people's, when their survival is in question, you can ask them for ideological change? I feel like that is an advantage that just some of us have.
I feel like that's a question I should be asking you.
Yeah. Something that I have really struggled with, because I do have these conversations, but perhaps with people in America, I can tell, we can talk about overcoming this narrative, this internalized narrative, and actually reclaiming our agency. But people in the refugee camp that I want to work with, how can you ask them of that, right? How can you ask them to to do an ideological and agency. They know the fact, but white people, like, they have to think, or this humanitarian organization that they're saving in order to do the work. I'm afraid that they may disappear if you tell them they're saving and criticize them.
Well, I often think, one of the things I often think about is that there's an image that refugees have nothing better to do than sort of wait for humanitarians to come in and do stuff for them, right? Which is exactly the opposite. I mean, the refugee communities that I've been engaged with, they're some of the hardest working people, and there's no, it's as though it's a situation where the refugees themselves should be guiding the process, but there's no mechanism in place to do that, right? In other words, it's built around sort of forms of measurement and so on, which are very Eurocentric in their format. It's built around sort of a grants-making process which is largely invisible or opaque to people outside, who don't know the language, if you will, of how to apply for grants or how to apply or do MEI modeling or any of these things. And so that this is, I think, what is troubling many of us is that I don't see a way forward for humanitarianism in its current structure to actually be effective in listening to the voices of refugees and others. In other words, the current way it's built is incapable of doing what we would like to do, what we'd like it to do, which is not be racist, not reinforce post-colonial or colonial narratives, not reinforce dependency. That it's so deeply built within that structure that it would have to be rebuilt, or a whole other way approach, thought in a different approach, thought about it entirely. And so yeah.
I'll say one more thing. Like with organizing and activism, with my aspect is perhaps refugees are not allowed to hold accountable people that have done the oppression, whether foreigners or like internally, right? We're allowed to just ask for humanitarian aid, because a lot of the times when we're doing fundraising, the people that are organizing know that my aspect of going from colonialism to how the refugee crisis, it led to the refugee crisis. But I'm told not to make the people who are gonna give the money, white individuals, right? Rich white individuals, uncomfortable by talking about colonialism. And that's something that I face every day, because it's like, I'm told, okay, you want them to give money, but you can't talk about colonialism and how all of this foreign intervention and oppression, as well as talking about like dictators. No, we're not like gonna ignore the dictators and the internal oppression, right? But it's like something that I always grapple with. I don't know what to do, because it's like, you want the funding and stuff to help the refugees, but you don't, like, there is not possibility of holding accountable so that we can move forward, perhaps even move forward.
And you bring up a very interesting point, which is that one of the structures of humanitarianism is that it sees itself as neutral, right? But it's anything but neutral, and it tends to require the assent of certain kinds of communities who are comfortable in their privilege. So it could be the rights-abusing dictator of a country, elite white people in Britain, any of these groups, right? And that any moment you object to that basis of privilege, then you've made them uncomfortable, and they're not going to give you money, or they're not going to let the aid pass a border in order for it to work. And so this is one of the reasons why imagining a different path might be important, but also whether or not the entire humanitarian industry should be preserved as it is, or whether or not it should be eliminated entirely. So.
Step in and take offer a question at the right now. So you have emphasized the importance of co-locating humanitarianism with human rights. There are some who don't make that connection, say these are distinct things, they have different histories, sort of. There's a kind of descriptive piece of that, how you would tell that history. And then there are, so if you would just say a little bit about that, and maybe also what that other perspective is, and feel free to say why you don't think that's the right one or where you disagree. But also why it is that human rights offers a kind of critical, constructive dimension to this correction or the, the proper reorienting of humanitarianism, because there are many critics of human rights as well who think that doesn't always get us into the really understanding the culture in which the people that we need and on the levels that we need to understand them. Does that make sense?
Sure. And I think this is, I'm reflecting on something you said, but make sure I do it right, which is that humanitarianism is largely unaccountable to the people it's supposed to serve, right? Whereas human rights creates a language of accountability. And so that's one of the areas that it's fundamentally different. The other is that human rights tends to incline towards empowerment in the political. Humanitarianism, by definition, seeks to depoliticize its activities. So those are two areas that I would really emphasize. Humanitarianism presents itself as neutral and apolitical, right? I mean, I'm a Rotarian, right? And we always talk about how we don't choose sides and so on, and that way we can get the polio vaccines into Afghanistan. And there's about to be a massive vaccine campaign in Afghanistan after many, many years of the Taliban saying that these vaccines are spreading, are done to make Muslim men infertile. And so back of the mind is saying, oh, so now humanitarianism is going to help solidify the public health control of Afghanistan by the Taliban, right? On the other hand, I don't want people getting polio. The question is, I have to think about this longer, what a rights-based approach to that might be, in which the Taliban are held accountable. This is about holding the Taliban accountable for public health measures in Afghanistan, not about securing and improving the Taliban's ability to control Afghanistan. And this is for years and years when we're looking at what's happening in Syria, where because Syria was the sovereign in the Syrian civil war, aid organizations were trying to get into areas that were under the control of the rebels, but under the current doctrines of humanitarianism, had to get permission from the Syrian government to bring humanitarian assistance to areas in opposition to them. And it often didn't happen. Some groups said, we don't care. So these are the two areas that really bother me in terms of contemporary humanitarianism. This neutrality, which is not neutral, its lack of accountability, and its failure to emphasize the political. Every refugee should have political agency in some form or another, regardless of whether or not they're in their homeland. That's a basic human rights idea, right? This goes back to Hannah Arendt. They have the right to have rights. Humanitarianism doesn't say that.
So, could you comment on humanitarianism in the context of modern secularization? Mm-hmm. Isn't that really what's going on here? You take even the language of the talk, the title of the talk.
So to some extent, I think that when I have a definition of modern humanitarianism in my first book, which really thinks about it in terms of a secular turn, right? That you were moving away from charity to humanitarianism. So charity will say the poor will always be with us. Humanitarianism will say, oh, we can solve poverty, right? And so what's interesting is my first book really looks at actual transitional figures in that. A generation previously, they were missionaries, and then they became League of Nations aid workers, right? So but I'm wondering, I'm wondering how secular some humanitarian work, the institution, the industry of humanitarianism really is. And that's also, certain ideas about sort of kind of almost a religiously informed notion of the self-help or the chosen or the worthy, as opposed to approaching people as human beings and their basic human rights approach.
So would you compare it to another model which is not like that? Let's say Jewish humanitarian aids after World War II. The
Sure.
Joint Distribution Committee was involved
Yeah, yeah.
in great work. So would that be a different way of approaching the same kind of problematic?
Well, when I write some about primarily the organizations after the First World War in Palestine, and how, in fact, some of these humanitarian organizations were able to operate as a quasi-government when the British occupation forces weren't allowing them to do so. But I think that modern humanitarians would like to claim that they are secular without, in fact, acknowledging how informed their operations are by historical ideas about religion, especially Protestant Christianity.
If you have any last questions, any students want to have any? No? Nobody wants to go? No? Yes, oh, yes. We'll take one last question and then thank you.
I'm just wondering, is there a model out there that has actually accomplished what you're trying to accomplish, or is it just not possible?
Well, there was, under the Obama administration, there was a lot of talk at USAID about developing rights-based humanitarianism. And Rajiv Shah, who's now the president of not the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, has been one of the people, he's now there. So I don't think that one of the things that I think came out of summer 2020 when everyone's emotions were high was how a lot of these things were not working properly. And that it just, as Javid had said, it just had not gotten far enough away from colonialism. And that it also, I think, points to some of these critical conversations we're having on campuses about DEI initiatives and so on, that this is about a much broader social conversation that must occur in Western Europe and North America, right? And at the end of that, we may abandon the humanitarianism that we seem to practice now. It may no longer be appropriate. And other sorts of ideas like just transfer of wealth, send money, which I think Northern European countries in particular don't like, that trying to address the structural inequalities that descend from underdevelopment, right? The wealth gap, and furthermore, I think that one of the things that humanitarianism will not be able to effectively address, which is the fact that what will be one of the great drivers of human misery in the areas of continuous humanitarian action will be climate change. And I don't see anything doing it. I think, for example, the Ford Foundation over the last 5 years ended many of their foreign projects precisely for this reason, and then began to move its funding more into addressing specifically inequalities in the United States. It reminds me of something one of my students once said when we were thinking about, why are there such terrible human rights abuses in China? Which is in fact true. There are terrible human rights abuses in China, and why can't we do anything about it? And one of my students noted that, well, maybe if we can address our own human rights abuses, we will be more credible and more persuasive when we engage outside. So, thank you again. And I'll just say that as a scholar, tough questions are valuable, are absolutely valuable, right? It's just part of the process, and it's one of the things that I just missed when we were all on Zoom, like looking someone in the eye and like feeling the energy of the question. It's very important to me. So I appreciate it very much, and I hope I can talk more with everyone outside.
Thank you so much. If you have enjoyed this talk, we hope we'll return again for more talks like this. Please support the center's activity. You can go to csrc.asu.edu/support. Thank you for coming here, and please join us for the reception, which is just outside. It's a beautiful evening, so please enjoy the rest of the evening with us. Thank you.